Duncan Wood is director of the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute. He joins us for an update on U.S.-Mexico relations, which got off to a rocky start in the Trump era. Have things settled down?
Morning, John. Yeah, things have actually progressed a great deal over the past couple of months. I think it's extraordinary the way in which the institutional approach has really begun to pay off for both sides. What we've seen is that since the low point in bilateral relations, that was the cancellation of the Mexican president's visit, the tweet storm, and that ongoing debate about who was going to pay for the wall on the border, that in fact there was this gentleman's agreement not to talk about that one particular issue in public anymore, and that allowed everything else to kind of work its way through.
Create space for other things.
Exactly. But we also have to give a great deal of credit, I would say, to the Mexican government for the way in which they have developed a strategy that is based upon putting the entire relationship on the table and saying, look, if you want to talk trade, we're happy to talk trade. But we also need to talk about migration and security, investment. Everything is tied together. We want to be friends. We want to work together. We want to collaborate. But we need to collaborate on all of these different issues.
Mexico must be relieved to see Canada take some heat for a change.
It's interesting. It was a bit of a shock for the Mexicans because the language during the campaign and during the transition period, indeed early on in the Trump administration, was that Canada isn't the problem, it's Mexico. And then all of a sudden, seemingly out of the blue, you had the attacks on Canada on softwood lumber and on dairy products, of course. And that has brought about a kind of common cause between Mexico and Canada. Canada had been sending many of the right signals down to Mexico City saying, look, we're not going to intervene in your own issues with the United States, but we believe that all of these bigger issues are best dealt with on a trilateral basis. This attack on Canada has given Mexico the opportunity to say almost exactly the same thing, saying, look, softwood lumber and dairy, those are your issues with the United States, they don't involve us, but we do believe that the broader relationship is a regional trilateral relationship that's better if we all sit down around the table together.
Beyond these recent developments, for obvious reasons, we often talk about U.S.-Canada relations or U.S.-Mexico relations. What about taking U.S. out of the equation of relations across the United States between Mexico and Canada?
It's funny because when I lived in Mexico City, this was actually what I did for 17 years. I studied the Canada-Mexico relationship. And for many years, it was the most dry and boring relationship that anybody could study. And we all kept saying, I wish there would be a dispute or something so that we could have something to talk about. And then the two countries began to get to know each other. And rather than being distant neighbors, or the neighbor's neighbor as they often called each other, they began to have things in common, particularly after the invasion of Iraq in the early 2000s. They found that they were in similar positions vis-a-vis their relationship with the United States, and they began to work together. In the mid-2000s, Canada actually began to identify Mexico as a strategic partner and one of the most important countries in the world for the future of Canada. But unfortunately, a lot of that was just rhetoric. And so the question we asked at that time was, where's the beef? And finally, we got our issue. That was a dispute between Canada and Mexico when Canada imposed the visa on Mexican citizens a few years ago, which was recently taken away again. But it caused a big breach in relations, and Mexico and Canada had to sit down with each other and talk to each other. And of course, the next turning point came with the election of Justin Trudeau as Prime Minister of Canada. And since then, we've actually seen the two countries coming much closer together. Still, their mutual relationship in economic terms is a dwarf in comparison with their relationships with the United States. And it really is the third bilateral relationship in North America that sits as being a minor one, a junior one, relative to the two bilateral relations with the U.S.
And you recently traveled to Mexico. Can you tell us who you met with and what you spoke about?
Yeah, we're very lucky. It was myself and Ambassador Tony Wayne traveled down last week to Mexico City, and we were fortunate enough to meet with a number of cabinet secretaries, with the Interior Minister, Miguel Ángel Osorio Chong, the Finance Minister, Jose Antonio Meade, and with the Foreign Secretary, Luis Videgaray. And we also met with the President's Chief of Staff, Carlos Perez Verdilla, and one of the presidential candidates as well. Now, we met with them on Tuesday, and all of them expressed cautious optimism about the relationship, expressing many of the things that I've already talked about, the institutional mechanisms, the strategic nature of the relationship. But all of them also said, we think things are going well, but we're never sure what's coming next because President Trump has this capacity to surprise us. there is always a certain degree of unpredictability in this in this situation. And of course, the next day was Wednesday, and that's when the president announced that the United States would be pulling out of NAFTA. And that, of course, caused everybody to run around in a panic. It was eventually resolved, but it's reinforced the idea that nothing can be taken for granted in this relationship at this time.
Are Mexican officials taking every tweet, every utterance from the president seriously, or are they starting to calibrate their reaction in a way that you've seen happen within this country, where even members of Congress will say, "I don't take everything he says literally"?
It's a combination of the two things. One is that there's no longer necessarily the same shock effect as we've seen before, because you expect that there is going to be a tweet. But remember that the relationship with the United States is an existential question for Mexico. So if you see a breakdown of the trading relationship with the United States, that directly impacts upon the prosperity, security, stability of the country. So they have to take it seriously.
Can't afford not to take it seriously.
Exactly.
So the 800-pound gorilla, or the elephant in the room, whatever metaphor you want, is NAFTA and a pending renegotiation of NAFTA. Did you discuss that in your meetings?
Yeah, we talked a lot about that, and the kind of issues that will be included in the negotiation, at least what Mexico hopes to see on the table. We talked a little bit about the draft document that came out of USTR a few weeks ago, and generally there was optimism expressed about that document. In addition, Mexico is very, very enthusiastic about getting this done quickly. And they recognize that the United States has to have a 90-day waiting period, which means that the earliest we could start this is early fall. But a NAFTA renegotiation, from the point of view of the Mexicans, would have to be completed by the end of this calendar year.
Because of elections?
Because of elections in 2018.
And U.S. elections coming up, too, could factor into that equation.
Exactly. Now, Mexico is very, very concerned about the first 6 months of next year, partly because everybody will be in campaign mode and no one's going to focus actually on negotiating or approving a renegotiated NAFTA. Then after the election, there is a very long 5-month transition period in Mexico before the new president comes in. And there's a lot of concerns in Mexico that a more nationalistic or left-wing president might not be in favor of a renegotiated NAFTA, which means that they're putting forward the case that if we don't get this done before the end of 2017, it'll be 2019 before this issue can really be dealt with.
Is that a serious concern? Can you lay out the electoral landscape for us now, what it looks like in Mexico in anticipation of the election?
Yeah, it's a very close race right now in Mexico, and obviously we're still more than a year away from the election, so there's a long way to go. But in the polls, we see the left-wing candidate, the leading left-wing candidate, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, holding a lead in many polls. In some polls, he is slightly behind the center-right candidate, Margarita Zavala. We're not sure if Margarita Zavala is actually going to be the candidate for the center-right PAN party in 2018. That has yet to be decided. There are a couple of other challengers who might go against her. And the PRI, the current ruling party, is in third place in the polls, but is beginning to catch up. This is a race which will certainly tighten as the election gets closer, and there's a lot of factors that can come into play. One of the most important factors from the point of view of the current Mexican government, though, is the bilateral relationship. What they're trying to avoid is any reason why an anti-American, anti-Yankee candidate would be able to seize upon the current state of the relationship and say, well, you need to vote for me so that I can redress the balance.
You mentioned the larger concerns beyond NAFTA and beyond trade. Are there other issues that are affected by this timeline tied to the elections where Mexican officials would like to see quick progress before it's too late?
Well, I think that the single most important factor right now is that investment is stalled in Mexico. Because of the uncertainty, you're not seeing any major investments either by foreigners, foreign direct investment, or by Mexican companies themselves, because everybody's waiting to see how the NAFTA negotiations turn out. So the sooner that's resolved, the better, so that money can begin to flow again.
Duncan, as always, appreciate all the great information. One final thought from you is, where's the action going to be in the short term? What are you looking at? What are the important issues or events that may give us an indication of how some of these larger issues will play out?
I think the single most important data point that we're looking for right now is what is it that the United States actually wants from these negotiations. And once we know that, then we'll be able to see how both Canada and Mexico can react. Because they have their own ideas, but they don't really mean a great deal until you know what the sort of the biggest partner in the relationship is looking for. And so I think once we know that, once we know what the United States is really looking for from this renegotiation, Canada and Mexico will be able to sit
Do you
down.
expect to get that?
I think we're going to get that relatively soon. If the Trump administration wants to begin negotiations in the fall of this year, they're going to have to identify those issues sooner rather than later.
Well, thanks again for joining us. Always appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, John.